Our next speaker is coming from the Forest Service Office of Tribal Relations. Her name is Sandy Marin, and she has been with the agency for quite a while in different types of avenues and different types of positions. So it's really great to hear from her. And we actually would have another presenter, but unfortunately she was unable to join us. But I do want to give her credit because she's been also helpful in getting all this stuff together. And her name is Angela Pittman. She also works for the Forest Service Office of Tribal Relations as the training coordinator. And so right now, I'll just get right into it with Sandy's bio. So Sandy Marin is a tribal relations specialist with the Office of Tribal Relations at the USDA Forest Service Washington office. She joined the Office of Tribal Relations in September 2020 after completing a 12-month internship with the Resource Assistant Program, serving in the offices of Tribal Relations and Conservation Education. Sandy was first introduced to the Forest Service as a Youth Conservation Corps crew leader on the Monongahela National Forest. She earned her Bachelor's of Science degree in Natural Resources with an emphasis in global change, ecology, and management. And that was from the University of Arizona back in 2016. And thank you so much again, Sandy, for joining us and providing us this presentation. I've seen this presentation before, and I'm very excited for this to all get started and to be shared with everybody. And Sandy is such a joyful presenter to experience. And with that, I will let Sandy, or actually Thomas, to kind of bring forward some of the tech support. And Sandy, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you, Latasha. Oh, I have to say, hearing you say back in 2016, that hit me. I just want to do a quick audio check. If I have my microphone down here, can you hear me okay? Or do I need to hold it closer? Sounds good? Okay,
Sounds
great.
good.
Thank you for that great introduction, Latasha. So hello, everybody. My name is Sandy Marin, and I'm a tribal relations specialist with the Office of Tribal Relations at the Washington office, so the national headquarters of the Forest Service. And also, like Latasha said, it's unfortunate that she's not able to join us today, but I just want to give another big shout out to Angela Pittman, who's a policy analyst with the Office of Tribal Relations, training coordinator, and also my mentor. And we work together to put together this presentation to share with you all. She has been with us throughout all stages of the development of the presentation. So just want to give a big shout out to her. And so now I want to start by saying that I have been employed with the Office of Tribal Relations for 2 years, actually exactly 2 years today. I realized that right before I jumped on the presentation. It's my 2-year anniversary of working for the Forest Service as a federal employee. And before that, like Latasha said, I was a resource assistant intern serving the offices of Tribal Relations and Conservation Education. So all that to say, 2 years is but a blip in the federal timescale. So my tenure working in tribal relations is short, and I am by no means an expert. I will always be a student, and I am so grateful to be here with you all today to share some introductory information about the federal tribal relationship, about tribal relations at the Forest Service, and about careers in tribal relations at the Forest Service. So I want to kick it off today with a video from some experts. It's a 5-minute video about treaties. And so I will ask to go ahead and play the video next on the next slide. And that will get us started today. Thank you.
Well, I think non-Native people know that treaties were signed. That might be it.
A treaty is fundamentally an agreement between two nations.
Treaties are only made between sovereign governments.
In fact, the U.S. has made more than 300 treaties with American Indian nations.
The United States' existence, when it first won the war against Great Britain, was very precarious, and many countries around the world did not recognize the United States' sovereignty.
So the U.S., as a way to assert that it was a sovereign, it made agreements with Native nations to sort of say to Europe, to Britain, hey, we're sovereign too, we can make these agreements.
The idea that treaties somehow gave status or standing or land to indigenous nations is probably the main fallacy that exists.
I think that many people view treaties as special rights for Indians.
They're not rights given to Native nations. They're Native nations, by and large, giving rights to the United States. I think a lot of people lack an understanding that wherever they live, there's probably a treaty that gives them the right to live there, granted to them by Native nations.
A nation relinquished the majority of its land rights, its land holdings, its resource holdings, for the right to preserve its way of life.
The rights that are reserved are more easily defined by the U.S. courts as property rights, but better defined by our traditional and cultural understandings as being relationship rights to the land, the water, and all of the beings that we hunt and fish and share that world with.
It's through treaties that I think we've been able to hold off a lot of forces that would like to see us erased from the continent.
I'm trying to think of one treaty that, from the perspective of the indigenous nation, has been fully upheld and implemented.
A lot of people disregard our treaties and say they're a thing of the past, they've been broken, let's forget about them. They would like to wipe away the treaty history of the United States, but that's simply not how it works.
Our United States Constitution recognizes that once a treaty is signed and ratified by the Senate, it becomes the, quote, supreme law of the land.
What that means is that a treaty, it's as much alive as the U.S. Constitution is.
Are they living documents? Do they exist, and do they transcend generations? The answer is absolutely yes.
When people question the relevance of treaties and say, I don't think treaties are relevant, my response is, then just give us the land back.
We're not talking about past history, we're talking about today. The best example of that is the Dakota Access Pipeline.
I think we saw before the world community the violation of the 1868 and 1851 treaties of the United States with the Lakota Nation in Standing Rock.
It brought the violation of treaty rights to today. Even though tribes have been experiencing those violations time after time after time,
Treaties go both ways.
This was a two-way street, that it was a shared history.
It's about mutual respect.
Non-native peoples are treaty partners, the descendants of the treaty signers, you could say, on the United States side.
I think that the way that we bring everybody into the conversation is we have curriculum that accurately reflects the reality of what an Indian treaty is. That's something we do for the United States Constitution and the three branches of government. Why don't we have a tribal component to that education?
The ancestors who negotiated the treaties, they were doing their best to protect us, to protect our culture, and protect our way of life.
And to me, that's a responsibility and a way in which I should live my life every day, to remember to honor those ancestors that fought so I could be here today.
Treaties are living documents because tribes continue to breathe life into them. We continue to speak their terms. We continue to remember the promises.
Love that video every time. This video is so important because treaties are the longest lived documentation of the political and legal relationship between the U.S. federal government and sovereign tribal nations. All 193 million acres that the Forest Service manages now are the ancestral territories of tribal nations. And as stewards of Forest Service managed lands, all the work that we as Forest Service employees do touches tribal nations in some way. And so that's why it's so important to have some basic competencies when it comes to the federal tribal relationship, because tribal relations at the Forest Service and all across the federal government, it is everybody's job. Next slide, please. So this is an overview. Today, I'm going to go through a crash course in tribal relations at the Forest Service. I'm going to start broad by talking about events that shaped and still shape the present day federal tribal government to government relationship. Then I'm going to zoom in and talk about tribal relations specifically at the Forest Service, and then going to talk about career opportunities in tribal relations at the agency. So before I continue, I just want to put it out there and share that some of the information I'm going to talk about in the beginning of this presentation is hard to hear. I talk about some of the violence and atrocities committed at the hands of the federal government. And I just want to share that my intent is not to stoke generational trauma. My intent is to bring about a common understanding of the relationships between tribal nations and the federal government through time, since European settlers arrived on this continent to present day. With that said, let's move on to the next slide. The Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny. The Doctrine of Discovery was a document created by European settlers in the 1400s that established a spiritual, political, and legal justification for the colonization and seizure of so-called uninhabited land, or land inhabited by anyone that wasn't practicing Christianity. So upon arrival in what is now called North America, the European settlers sought to displace indigenous peoples and claim the land as their own. And their justification for doing this was the Doctrine of Discovery. It's estimated that around 100 million indigenous people lived in the Americas when Columbus arrived. But because of this doctrine of discovery, the settlers considered the land unoccupied and thereby conquerable. You can see reflections of the doctrine in the 19th century Manifest Destiny philosophy that colonists were destined to conquer and settle the entire North American continent. Westward expansion started in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. This land became more desirable after the Lewis and Clark expedition to the Pacific Ocean and the discovery of new territory to the west of the Mississippi. These same principles of doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny were later used to justify the Indian Removal Act, the forced removal of Native Americans and other groups from their homes during the 19th century westward expansion of the United States. The actions that resulted from the implementation of these principles were devastating, to say the least. There was a lot of bloodshed, loss of life, and loss of land. Next slide. On this slide, you can see just how much Indigenous land holdings were impacted from the time of colonization up until modern day. In 1492, you can see the lands represented in orange or in yellow are Indigenous lands. All of the lands in the nation are Indigenous lands in 1492. In 1790, colonists had established and colonized those colonies on the eastern side of the United States. And you can see more spread of colonization in 1860, all the way up until 2009, where roughly 2% of the original territories of tribal nations still remain in tribal ownership. This history shapes how tribes today perceive and interact with the federal government and its representatives. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the federal-tribal relationship. If you could go to the next slide. And the next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to talk about the eras of federal policy regarding relationships with tribal nations. Starting with the treaty-making era from 1778 to 1871. So as we learned earlier, treaties established the earliest pattern of legal and political interaction between the US government and tribes. Europeans signed the first treaties with tribes in the early 1600s, and in 1778, the newly formed United States signed its first treaty with the Delaware tribe. By 1871, when the treaty-making era formally ended, the US had entered into more than 350 treaties with tribes. Overlapping with the treaty-making era was the removal era from 1830 to 1850, marked by the Indian Removal Act, which removed many tribes from their eastern homelands to lands west of the Mississippi River, especially into an area now known as Indian Territory, which is called the State of Oklahoma. The mass removals that happened during this period included the Trail of Tears, the long journey traveled primarily on foot, during many which died. Removal policies later gave way to the reservation system. From 1850 to 1891, numerous treaties and other written agreements were made that required tribes to relocate to distant territories or confine them to smaller areas that were reserved portions of the tribe's aboriginal territories. These reservations were created by treaties, statutes, and executive orders. The allotment and assimilation era from 1887 to 1934 was marked by the General Allotment Act, which is also called the Dawes Act. Passed in 1887, it broke up the communal reservation lands and assigned individual parcels called allotments to tribal members. These parcels were to be held in trust for 25 years, and because of their trust status, these parcels of land could not be sold, leased, or otherwise conveyed by their Native American owners without federal approval. After the 25-year trust period expired, the titles to the parcels of land were to be converted to full tribal ownership, and any of the remaining reservation land which had not been allotted to tribal members was declared as surplus and opened for settlement. During this period in 1924, U.S. citizenship was granted to all Native Americans by the Snyder Act. So that means the original inhabitants of this continent were not considered U.S. citizens until 1924, yet served in the military and supported the nation in so many ways. Also during this time, Native people were prohibited from speaking their own languages, the original languages of North America. Reorganization policy from 1934 to 1953 was marked by the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which ended the allotment of reservations, ensured that those allotted parcels still held in trust would not convert to that full ownership status, and it also reaffirmed that tribal governments had inherent powers. The act also provided a mechanism for the formalization of tribal governments through written constitutions and charters for tribes that would agree to federal oversight. Following reorganization policy was the termination era from 1953 to 1968. During this period, many of the reorganization era reforms were reversed, primarily by the US government's decision to terminate the federal recognition of many tribes. The termination policy was intended to further promote the assimilation of Native Americans into mainstream American society. In some cases, termination led to a loss of federal services and resources for those tribes, and even near extinction for some, especially in California. Some of the tribes who had their federal recognition terminated during this period have successfully petitioned to have their federal recognition restored, but many have not been successful. So after 1968, that brings us to the present day era of self-determination. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, federal tribal policy began to support the concept of self-determination and self-governance. Various laws and presidential policies strengthened support for tribal governments and reaffirmed federal acknowledgement of tribal sovereignty. Next slide. So federal tribal law and policy. Now, I won't list all of these acts. This isn't even an exhaustive list of all the federal tribal policy that's out there, but I just want to demonstrate to you the vast amount of legislation that exists with regard to tribal nations. The U.S. has been legislating Native peoples ever since it was founded. Next slide. So let's talk about the Constitution. There are two places in the Constitution that are particularly significant for tribal nations. So first is Article 1, Section 8, where the U.S. government was given absolute authority to regulate commerce with tribes. And this authority that the U.S. government gave itself are called plenary powers. And then Article 6, Clause 2, where treaties are recognized as the supreme law of the land. You may have heard that phrase used earlier in the video, and this is where that comes from. Treaties are recognized as supreme law of the land in the U.S. Constitution. And both of these constitutional provisions are very relevant and in use today. And Article 6, Clause 2, that is what makes treaties so powerful, important, and unwavering. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about the federal trust responsibility, which comes about from a combination of the U.S. Constitution as well as Supreme Court case law. The federal trust responsibility is a legal obligation under which the United States has charged itself with moral obligations of the highest responsibility and trust toward tribal nations. It is a legally enforceable fiduciary obligation on the part of the United States to protect tribal treaty rights, lands, assets, and resources, as well as a duty to carry out the mandates of federal law with respect to tribes. In several cases discussing the trust responsibility, the Supreme Court has used language suggesting that it entails legal duties, moral obligations, and the fulfillment of understandings and expectations that have arisen over the entire course of the relationship between the United States and federally recognized tribes. A contemporary example of exercising the federal trust responsibility was in the Cobell versus Salazar litigation, when the Department of Interior was found guilty of violating the federal trust responsibility by mishandling trust funds for Native Americans. This case was settled in 2009 for $3.4 billion. Next slide. Okay, so after giving you the big picture overview of the federal government at large relationship between tribal nations and the government, I am going to zoom into our sphere of work at the USDA and at the Forest Service. So the USDA and Forest Service, we execute the federal laws that are established by Congress and the executive branch. Within that, we establish our own department and agency-specific policies and procedures that are responsive to the legislation that directs our work. The USDA has several regulations that are relevant to tribal relations, as well as a recent action plan on tribal consultation. At the Forest Service, we also have our directives that dictate tribal relations, roles, and responsibilities across the agency. And we are also in the final stages of developing our own agency-wide tribal relations action plan. In fact, we are in the final stages of this action plan, so final that at this very moment, our action plan is being briefed to our agency's leadership. So it's a very exciting time. You could go to the next slide, please. Tribal relations at the USDA Forest Service. So I just want to show you kind of what our structure looks like. Tribal relations, like I said earlier, is everybody's jobs. It transects all of the work that is done in the Forest Service, and it happens at every level of the agency, on the national scale, on the regional scale, and on the local unit level scale. So we have a National Office of Tribal Relations in the State and Private Forestry Deputy area of the Washington office. So that is where I am situated. Then the Forest Service is divided into nine geographic regions across the nation. And within each of those regions, there is a tribal relations program managers who oversees all of the tribal relations related activities that happen within that region. And then within each region, we have the national forests and grasslands. And so some national forests have full-time tribal liaisons. Some national forests have part-time tribal liaisons. And we are working currently to expand the capacity, because I can tell you that tribal relations, it's a full-time job, and we are working on expanding tribal relations capacity. And so there are a lot of big hiring efforts that are happening right now at this very moment and will be happening into the future. If you could go on to the next slide. So now let's talk about how the Forest Service interacts with sovereign tribal nations in a contemporary way and in present day. We work through cooperation and collaboration. They are part of us fulfilling our federal trust responsibility to acting in the best interest of tribal nations. Native people are the original stewards of the lands that the Forest Service now manages, and have a very active role in managing the land for ecosystem services and function. And we at the Forest Service really benefit a lot from the millennia of knowledge that tribal nations can offer. So we really work on cooperation and collaborations to effectively manage national forests and grasslands. But we do have to ensure that we're always, as agency staff, are always listening thoughtfully and implementing this knowledge in a respectful and appropriate way, and in conjunction with the Indigenous knowledge holders. So there are many ways that the Forest Service collaborates with tribes. This can include on developing national level or local level policies. There can be on-the-ground work and project implementation, fire mitigation, entering into partnership on projects of mutual interest, and using tribal authorities to get shared work done. And that's just to name a few. Next slide. So we also interact with tribal nations through a formal process called consultation. Tribal consultation is the process by which the federal government gains information and advice from tribal governments in the development of policy or impacts of projects. Any project or policy that is deemed to have tribal implications must be consulted upon. Policies that have tribal implications, it's a legal term that refers to regulations, legislative comments, or proposed legislation, and other policy statements or actions that have substantial direct effects on one or more tribes, on the relationship between the federal government and tribes, or on the distribution of power and responsibilities between the federal government and tribes. Tribal consultation was first mandated by Executive Order 13175 in the year 2000. And as I hopped on, I heard Lawrence talking about the executive order. So you already know about it. And it has since been reaffirmed by subsequent presidential memoranda, the most recent one being on January 26, 2021. USDA developed a departmental regulation on tribal consultation requiring that each agency provide an opportunity for tribes to participate in policy development. The opportunity must be timely, meaningful, and government to government. And here at the Forest Service, we also have a policy on tribal consultation. Next slide. So sacred sites are another incredibly important element of the work that the Forest Service does because there are many sacred sites on national forests and grasslands on lands that the Forest Service manages. So there's an executive order 13007 on the accommodation of access to and preservation of sacred sites. It defines a sacred site as a location of cultural and religious significance to a tribal nation. A sacred site could be a lake, a cave, mountain, landscape, viewshed. And sometimes sacred sites locations aren't known by or shared with the Forest Service, and that's okay. We are still able to protect and provide accommodations to sacred sites, regardless of if we know the location or not. The locations are held and known by tribal nations, and basically will direct us on how we should be protecting them as an agency. You could go to the next slide. So just want to share some tribal relations resources. They're particularly relevant to tribal relations at the Forest Service. Like I said earlier, we are in the end stages of writing a tribal relations action plan that will help provide guidance and goals on how we can improve the tribal relations program at large within the agency, and also continue to work towards fulfilling our federal trust responsibility. Also take note, the last bullet on the slide, which I'm really excited about, is that the Office of Tribal Relations recently launched a mobile application. It's a mobile field guide for all things tribal relations. It's available for anyone to download, and I'll give you some more information on the app in case you're interested in downloading it towards the end of this presentation. So if you could go to the next slide. So in terms of elements that are needed for working in tribal relations, one of the really important elements is having cultural competency in going from a place of unconscious incompetence where we don't know what we don't know to a place of unconscious competence where we're inherently able to have conversations in a culturally informed way. Next slide. Okay. So right now, in this moment, it's a really exciting time to be a Forest Service employee working in tribal relations. We have a lot of things to look forward to, and I will just talk about a couple of them now. So within 1 week of taking office, President Biden issued a memorandum on tribal consultation and strengthening nation-to-nation relationships. This memorandum set the stage for a host of actions and activities that would come to take place under this administration. President Biden reinvigorated the Tribal Nation Summit, which is a gathering of tribal leaders and U.S. federal government leaders, and hosted the first Tribal Nation Summit in almost 5 years in November 2021, and we'll expect to see another Tribal Nation Summit in November of 2022. So during the Tribal Nation Summit of 2021, there were a lot of new laws and orders and memoranda that were enacted that did a number of things. but also increased funding and opportunities for the Forest Service to do work in cooperation and collaboration with tribal nations, such as the bipartisan infrastructure law, which provided millions of dollars for the Forest Service to be able to do work in partnership with tribes. There's also the Joint Secretarial Order on fulfilling the federal trust responsibility in the stewardship of federal lands and waters. That affirms that the federal government has to manage federal lands in co-stewardship with tribal nations. So that means sharing the decision-making space with tribal nations on what are the best ways to manage the land. And there was also a White House memorandum on Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and federal decision making, which mandates that as federal employees and at the Forest Service, we are required to apply and consider Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in all of the decisions that we make. And because of these orders setting the precedent for great new work, we're seeing some great things, like tribes are taking on the management of visitor centers on national forests. Like I said earlier, we're also seeing unprecedented amounts of funding come in for the Forest Service to work in cooperation with tribes on things like ecosystem restoration, fire management, climate change. That's just to name a few. I'm sure Latasha can list some more, and we'll probably share some later on during the workshop. So if you could go to the next slide. And so I just described a number of exciting things that are happening in tribal relations. And so what that means is there is a lot of new work to be done, and work that we will need to accomplish by hiring more folks to work in tribal relations at the Forest Service. So the Forest Service is hiring. The agency just finished a round of hiring several new tribal liaison positions. And that's just the first of several rounds of tribal relations hiring that the agency will do as the workload increases all across the agency in response to more opportunities for cooperation and collaboration with tribal nations. So I'm sure many of you have heard infamously how hard it can be to get a job in federal service. Well, at the Forest Service and at USDA, we have a tribal hiring advisory for tribal relations positions that helps specify the kinds of skills and knowledge that we're looking for in tribal liaisons. This advisory is really designed to recruit candidates who have the knowledge to work in these positions. And so some of the knowledge that we're talking about, it can be taught in schools, and some of it cannot. The Forest Service needs folks with generational knowledge, traditional knowledge, Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, Native knowledge, the kind of knowledge that is passed down from generation to generation. And this is the kind of knowledge that many of you innately hold inside yourselves. So no matter where you are across the nation, there is probably a tribal relations job somewhere near you. Since tribal relations happens at all levels of the agency, there are positions in every part of the agency, at the national level in Washington, D.C., in regional offices all across the nation, at national forests and grasslands, and also doing research and development. There are positions popping up all over the agency at the Forest Service. So whatever work you're interested in doing, or wherever you are interested in living, there is probably a way to work in tribal relations within your interests and within your location. So I also put here that working in tribal relations and working in the Forest Service is the opportunity to do work that matters. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about my reflections on what this means to me by sharing a bit of a personal story about how I came to work in tribal relations and for the Forest Service. So, believe it or not, when I first graduated from college in 2016, I was pretty against the idea of working in federal service. I knew about the past and current atrocities being committed by the federal government, and I wanted no part of it. I definitely had kind of a one-sided view of what the federal government does. At that time, I didn't even realize that there are amazing people working for the federal government, fighting hard every day and leading from where they are to affect positive change in their workplaces and in the world around them. So, never thinking that federal service would be an option for me, I set out in 2016 after graduating college to work in the private industry. So I trudged along for a few years working in sales in the solar energy industry. And I came to terms with the fact that that work just did not fill my cup. I wasn't fulfilled in the work I did, so I quit. And maybe I would not recommend this, but I did quit without having another job lined up yet. I had heard a little bit about the Forest Service and I learned about some Forest Service summer positions. So I decided to apply thinking, okay, it's just a summer. You know, if I don't like it, I can just move on. So I learned about the Youth Conservation Corps and I decided to apply to become a crew leader for the Youth Conservation Corps for a summer on the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. So like I said, I figured it was a summer job, 2 or 3 months. And, you know, if I didn't like it, then I could move on. I was still, you know, still really unsure about whether or not this federal service stuff would be right for me. Well, surprise, I really liked the work. I had a lot of fun and it felt really fulfilling working on a national forest. No 2 days were the same. Every day was full of adventure and excitement. We worked really hard and we also had fun. And I was able to connect with people that I still talk to today. Some still work for the federal government and may have gone on to work for the Forest Service. And that was a really terrific experience. And it was through the Youth Conservation Corps crew leader program that I found out about the Resource Assistance Program, which that's a program you'll learn all about in depth earlier. Um, so I found out about the Resource Assistance Program and I decided to apply for a 12-month internship working in tribal relations and conservation education at the Forest Service headquarters. And so again, you know, I'm here thinking, okay, it's a year. You know, if after a year I'm still not sure. But then my first day rolled around, and it was probably even within the first week that I came to that realization that there are amazing people working in the federal government. There are people that truly want to see the world become a better, more just place and want to help be on a good side of history in moving the federal government to a positive place of justice, of righting past wrongs. And I really found that working within the Office of Tribal Relations and working in tribal relations at the Forest Service. So I have to say that deciding to work in tribal relations just might be one of the best decisions I have ever made. And now I don't doubt that this is the right place for me to be. And I'm really privileged and honored to be able to work in tribal relations and do this work that matters so much every day. So there is my my offer, my ask for you to consider a career in tribal relations as you move forward in your academic careers and start to pursue job and internship opportunities. So like I said, there are jobs in tribal relations in the Forest Service, and there are also internships. The Resource Assistance Program that you will learn about later offers positions in tribal relations. And Latasha, I see you came on camera. I wasn't sure if maybe there was something you wanted to share here, or should I? Okay, I'll keep going, and maybe I'll hook you in at the. I have just a few more minutes left in the presentation, then we can move to Q&A. So if you could go to the next slide. So like I said earlier, wanted to bring up our tribal relations mobile app if you want to get a flavor and idea of the kind of work that happens in tribal relations, and also the kind of information that is needed to work in tribal relations. I have some QR codes here on the screen. If you want to download the app, you can download it on both Apple or Android, and you can download it on a personal device. You don't have to have a government phone. And so this is just a really a great window into what tribal relations looks like, the kind of laws that we work from, and just learn more about the program in general. Now, if you could go to the next slide. So that brings me to the end. Thank you all so much for having me here today. Latasha, thank you so much for the invitation to present on tribal relations and provide more information about career opportunities in tribal relations. And now I'd like to open it up and answer any questions that anyone might have. And Latasha, if you want to share anything, please feel free.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much, Sandy. I just want to kind of segue as well into the Q&A as all. And looks like we do have a hand raised now. Let's see. Quick see. Kay. Okay, Kay has a question. Go ahead, Kay.
This is Kay with all the questions today. So, looking at tribal relations, I do know that our local forest is looking at the partnership coordinator recruitment. There's an intern and two, I think, one GS 911 and one GS 12 position open right now through the national hiring event. Is there a way to find out if there had been 700 applications received? Because we really want people to apply, but we're trying to tell people, hurry, apply, be the first 700. And also looking nationally with recruitment with the Forest Service or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, if you could share in advance with the tribes and tribal colleges the national hiring events we should be ready for. Thank you.
Certainly, I completely agree with you. And in terms of the work that I do for the Office of Tribal Relations, I just so happen to be the right person to talk to. So I'd love to connect with you, and any intel that we can provide early to tribal nations and tribal organizations about upcoming hiring events, we really want to do so. So I'd love to connect and look forward to getting the scoop on upcoming hiring events so we can share them out.
Great. So we'll connect. How should we do that? Should I just put my email in the chat box?
Okay, sure, that works. I'll grab it from there and I'll send you an email so we can connect.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I may just kind of follow up on that other question of when the USA job hits that certain limit. So from what I've experienced myself, just applying to some positions very similarly, there was no like status update on it, like, oh, we hit 100, we hit 200. Once I applied, and once the limit hit, it just sent an email saying that this position is closed now, the limit has been hit. But it took, I think, about 2 days for that to happen. So unfortunately, once you apply, you'll just get the notification of when the position closes. There's no in-between status update of how the numbers are rolling up. And do we have any other questions in the group regarding OTR, positions, etc.?
Like we just had a hand. Cassandra?
Hello, everybody. My name is Cassandra Begay, and I am a center manager at Phoenix Interagency Dispatch Center here in Region 3 with the Tono National Forest. And I know this call is for recruitment for youth career, etc. I'm a current agency employee with the Forest Service, have been for a very long time, and took an interest in tribal relations back in 2016 when Fred Clark was still the director. And as an agency employee trying to cross over from fire to this type of a job series, I'm having a little bit of difficulty, but I'm working through the opportunities that present itself. I just finished doing 120-day detail in Region 2 as the assistant program manager under Susan Johnson. And I just completed that. So here on the Tono, they've advertised a program manager, GS 1112, and then that vacancy was filled. So they opened up a 7-9-11 position. I don't feel like I have a chance here just due to program development and reference to the resource assistant program, because we want to use that program to recruit people into the agency as well. So for a person like me to attempt to get a better foot in the door in a permanent status in tribal relations, I know that I've had my challenges, and I do come from a Indigenous nation myself. I'm Dene, and I see that there are vacancies open. However, getting a true foot in the door over, the challenges with national and regional hiring events, it doesn't seem to be on the priority. So I'm just kind of throwing that out there for your awareness. We're trying to recruit people, but people even in our own agency at the Forest Service that have interests in tribal relations, it's been a challenge trying to get in. And I started kind of doing my own. Luckily, I have the support of my leadership to be able to do these different things. So other thing I just wanted to put out there too is I'm trying to get a non-promotional detail on the Coconino to attempt to help them out, because I don't think they've hired a tribal relations program manager yet. And I'm hoping to do that here mid-October for as long as I can do it. So that's kind of how I'm doing my own recruitment, my foot in the door, and just being proactive in a way to get into. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. And yes, there are definitely challenges. And if you're interested, I'd love to connect. And maybe the first thing that maybe came to mind is the hiring advisory for tribal relations positions. You probably already know about it, but that might be something to be able to use as a tool moving forward. But if it makes sense, I'd love to connect later.
Okay, that'd be great.
See. Okay, terrific.
Nice. Thank you, Cassandra. Anybody else have any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up now. So with that said, I do want to thank again Sandy Marin for joining us and giving us her time and her efforts on all the presentation, wealth of information that she's provided. I know I used to always learn something every time she presents. So again, thank you, Sandy, so much for that. And with
I dropped my contact info in the chat in case can't think of any questions right now. But if you do have a question later, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. And to follow up with that, we will be sending out a list of everybody's contact information, bios for folks to remind themselves of who did presentations on what, etc., and also having that open segue for folks to connect with other people. All right. And we are definitely ahead of schedule. It's actually quite nice. So I'd like to offer, if there's no other questions, I'd like to offer up a potential break, like a 5-minute break, before we get into our next session, which is